So we've talked about sex, and we've talked about how, first of all, what the advantage of sex is, and we've talked about how natural selection influences the allocation of resources through the life history. And that's a much bigger topic than just sex, but we've seen some examples of how that influences things like, reproductive strategies, sexual maturity, and even how many sexes you have at once. But when we talk about sexual selection, we're actually going back to Darwin's work again, because he laid a lot of this out in his book in 1870, don't care, called The Descent of Man. The first part of which laid out the evidence for human evolution as much as was known at the time. And the second part of which talked about his theory of sexual selection. And there's two major aspects of this. You can have competition between members of one sex for breeding rights, for what they're competing over is access to the opportunities to reproduce. Stereotypically, this is competition between males for access to breeding females, although this is not true all the time. And in fact, we will look at some important exceptions to that rule. The second aspect is selection of mates by members of one sex, and often, but not remotely always, this amounts to females choosing which male they're going to mate with. You could call the first intrasexual selection. Intrasexual selection would be competition between members of one sex. And then intersexual selection is selection acting between sexes, where members of one sex exert choice, picking individuals of the opposite sex to mate with. Before we get more into that, I'll note that both of these can happen in the same species, and they can both act independently of natural selection or together with it, or in some cases in opposition to natural selection. And I'll start with a famous case of sexual selection acting in opposition to natural selection, beginning in the 70s with the work of John Endler, who went down to Trinidad and studied wild populations of a very common freshwater fish called Pasilia reticulata, known as the common guppy. Guppies are pretty hardy freshwater fish native to South America and the Caribbean. If you go to any pet store with an aquarium department, you'll see several varieties of fancy guppies. Guppies have been selectively bred for at least 100 years. And there's all sorts of varieties with brilliant colors and oversized fins and wild patterns. They're quite attractive if you're into fish. A lot of people who keep a freshwater tank have kept guppies. This is what wild guppies looks like, and this is a male. Males have spots of various colors. They can be black, they can be orange, there can be iridescent spots as well. Females are a bit larger, and wild female guppies are silvery. They don't have any color. You do see colorful females in some of the fancy guppy strains that have been artificially selected, but female guppies just look like your average minnow. And we know that females prefer to mate with colorful males. I should mention, by the way, that in male guppies, one of the fins is modified as a sperm transfer organ. So the males will swim up and insert their gonopodium sperm transfer organ right into the female's urogenital aperture. So they actually mate directly, and females give birth to live young. The eggs develop and hatch inside the female's body. And so females do not just scatter their eggs and let them be fertilized by whatever sperm are available. They directly choose mates, and they prefer males with color. The more colorful males, the better. Endler found that if you looked at wild populations in Trinidad, there was a lot of variation in just how colorful the males were. And that was correlated with the population levels of predatory fish. In wild populations that had fewer predators, the males tended to be more colorful. When he introduced more predatory fish into wild guppy populations, what he found was that male guppies got less colorful over several generations. And the reason's not that hard to figure out. Colorful males would get more females and would leave more offspring. At the same time, colorful guppies are more visible to predators, and they'd have a better chance of getting eaten before they might even get to mate at all. So sexual selection, in the sense of intersexual selection, females choosing colorful males, tended to work to make the male guppies brighter over time. Natural selection imposed by the predators tended to favor more drab guppies, and which force ended up being stronger depended on how many predators there were. Guppies got more colorful where there weren't predators, less colorful where there were predators. So sexual selection can act in direct opposition to natural selection at times. There's actually very recently a new wrinkle was found because male color turns out to be phenotypically plastic, and males raised in water that's been exposed to predators will actually become more drab. So the phenotype is not absolutely fixed. There's some phenotypic plasticity playing into this as well. Kind of a neat trick for a guppy. Ah, Flounder, you're such a guppy. Right. The stereotype is that males compete with each other for females, like these wapiti, American elk, locking horns and fighting during the mating season. Males compete, and females are choosy about which males they allow to mate with them. That rule of thumb has become... Sorry, somebody's mic's on. Sorry, I'm just checking. I don't want to run over a question or comment that someone has. That's a rule of thumb we now know as Bateman's rule. Bateman observed this in fruit flies, which you might not think of as being very complex critters, but they do have courtship and mating behavior, and males will compete with each other and females will choose their mates. And Bateman argued this was generally true. And that goes all the way back to Darwin. Remember who he'd come up with this idea. It's mentioned in Origin of, excuse me. It's mentioned in Origin of Species, and then he developed it in The Descent of Man. And he was pretty sure that males were always competitive and females always selected the most beautiful males. So he writes about structures and instincts developed through sexual selection, the weapons of offense and the means of defense possessed by the males for fighting with and driving away their rivals, their courage and pugnacity, their ornaments of many kinds, their organs for producing vocal or instrumental music, and their glands for emitting odors. Most of these latter structures serving only to allure or excite the female. Sorry, talking about glands for emitting odors gives me a flashback to some embarrassing moments in puberty that makes me wonder if Darwin quite knew what he was talking about. Never mind that. Anyway, So he's pretty sure this applies to all species and proposed that it applied to humans too, and proposed that this gets kind of sexist, that the reason why men were so good at science and art and music and women just weren't that good was ultimately due to sexual selection, that the urge to create beautiful music or beautiful paintings had the same origin as the male turkey's urge to puff up his feathers and spread a big tail. For the record, he probably wasn't right. That started to crumble in the 1970s when people began to realize that there's actually a lot of exceptions to Bateman's rule, and looking at the exceptions can help you understand why sexual selection acts the way it does. So here's a couple of exceptions. The Australian katydid and its kin, which is also a big katydid and not a cricket. It's the Mormon cricket, so called because of its tendency to ring your doorbell. Actually, I'm joking. It's called the Mormon cricket because when the Mormon settlers settled in the Salt Lake Valley and planted their crops, there was a big population explosion of this species of insect that came and ate their crops. Now, Brigham Young prayed, and a big flock of seagulls came in and ate all of the crickets, saving the crops of the first Mormon settlers and making sure they wouldn't die of starvation out there. This is why there is a monument to seagulls right in the heart of Salt Lake City, right in front of the big temple in Temple Square. We can argue as to whether or not that would have happened anyway, but whatever. I have been out there when the Mormon crickets were swarming, and you'll see them crossing the roads in hordes, and stretches of the road will actually turn brownish red, where passing traffic has just run over countless thousands of Mormon crickets, and yet they keep coming. That population does tend to boom quite a bit in early summer. Anyway, what's so great about Mormon crickets? Mormon crickets and their kin, the katydids, males produce a sperm packet called a spermatophore. And this is not that uncommon. There's other arthropods that do this. There's even salamanders that do this, where the male will produce a sperm packet and then try to maneuver the female so that the sperm packet gets inserted into her genital opening. Instead of copulating, they'll make with the sperm packet. Katydids have an additional structure. It's called a spermatophylax, which is very rich in protein and very nutritious. The female gets to eat it. And in Mormon crickets, that spermatophylax may amount to 25% of a male's total body weight. So to make a spermatophylax requires an enormous investiture of energy, right? You've got to eat enough to get all those amino acids and then put them together to make whatever proteins are involved. And it's metabolically extremely expensive. Females eat the spermatophylax, so they get a direct nutritional benefit. And especially when food is scarce, female katydids compete with each other for access to males. Female katydids will fight over the male with the biggest spermatophylax. And that's a reversal of Bateman's rule. When food is abundant, females don't compete nearly so much. When food is scarce, females will fight each other. So there's a female cricket, female katydid with a male spermatophore and spermatophylax right there. Second example, another exception to Bateman's rule is pipefish. Pipefish and seahorses and sea dragons are all in the same family. You can recognize them because their jaws are fused into a little tube, so they can't eat anything but very small, usually small crustaceans that they kind of slurp up through a straw. Seahorses have that distinctive bent shape that makes their head look like a horse's head. Pipefish are a lot more straight. But what they all do is at mating, the female pipefish will lay her eggs inside a specialized pouch on the male's belly. In some species, it's not a pouch, it's just a strip of specialized skin. In others, it's fully enclosed, and the male will carry the eggs around, and eventually it's the male that gives birth. So the male has to expend energy, not just the weight of carrying them, but because the male will actually secrete oxygen through specialized tissues and provide that oxygen to the eggs in there. And that takes metabolic energy as well. And it turns out that male pipefish have been shown to be choosy about females, and females will compete with each other for access to particularly choice males. This is actually kind of grim because there's at least some species where if a male pipefish mates with a female and then finds a better female, he will cut off oxygen to the first female's eggs and kill her embryos so that he clears up space for the eggs of the second female that's more desirable. So you probably don't remember this, but about 20 odd years ago, this book was a big fad called The Rules. And there were whole clubs of so-called rules girls that would try to, work on these strategies for finding and keeping Mr. Right, the perfect man. I'm pretty sure this has gone completely out of fashion. Frankly, I kind of hope so. But the biological rules seem to be whichever sex invests more energy in reproduction has fewer opportunities to reproduce. If you invest a lot of energy in one reproductive event, you don't have enough energy to repeat that event very often. So in that case, if you have fewer opportunities to reproduce, selection will favor behavioral patterns by that sex that select mates of some kind of high quality. On the flip side, whichever sex invests less energy in reproduction can increase its fitness by reproducing as often as possible. And we call this difference the asymmetry of sex. Now, to the extent that this applies to Bateman's rule, females might be expected to be, in the first case, investing more energy in reproduction because by definition, the female is the one that produces the eggs. Eggs are bigger than sperm. It takes more energy to make an egg cell than a sperm cell. Yeah, there are, cases like the ostrich, that's very extreme. It may not be that extreme in all cases, but because we define the female as the one that makes the larger gamete, you get this asymmetry. It costs more energy to make a bigger cell, one that also usually contains nutrition in it. That being said, there can always be a lot of details in the life history that completely mess that up, that upset that asymmetry of sex. And it may mean that the sexes invest much more equally in reproduction, or in some cases, the male invests more. In the cases that we looked at, in the case of the pipefish, the male invests a great deal of energy in carrying those eggs around and ultimately giving birth. I'm not quite sure what's involved, but I've seen footage of male seahorses giving birth and they're exhausted afterwards. I think they they go through contractions, and that burns up energy. Um, katydids and Mormon crickets, the male has to invest an enormous amount of energy to make that spermatophylax. So in that species, the male is investing more. However, in the real world, people have gotten away from coming up with hard and fast rules in the first place. Um, I think where we've got to is more the Outback Steakhouse rule, which is, of course, no rules, just right, because so many other factors can affect the evolution of sexual behavior that you can't find any rules that don't have exceptions all over the place. Bateman was kind of onto something, but um, with so many qualifications that it isn't even really a very useful rule of thumb anymore. So if we look at a famous Australian organism, uh, Latrodectus hasseltii, this is the Australian redback spider. Like everything in Australia, it is deadly. Everything in Australia wants to kill you. You've got the deadliest spiders, the deadliest snakes, the deadliest sharks, the deadliest saltwater crocodiles, the deadliest jellyfish. Even kangaroos will kick the crap out of you if you get too close. You might be safe from those marsupial mice, but I'm not even sure there. So Latrodectus hasseltii is a relative of black widow spiders. Male redbacks are very small. They don't live very long. Female redbacks can live up to 2 years. A male redback can live 2 to 4 months. In this case, when a male finds a female, he'll pluck the strings of her web to let her know that he's approaching, and he'll crawl up onto the female. Female spiders male spiders copulate using a modified appendage, um, using a modified pair of appendages called pedipalps, which more generally they use as sense organs. So our male spider will fill his pedipalp with a sperm droplet. He's got a special receptacle for the purpose. He fills his appendage with a sperm droplet and then inserts that into the female opening. To do this, he has to somersault directly onto the female's jaws. The female then eats the male as he copulates, which is a behavior known as copulatory suicide or sexual cannibalism. You might wonder why the male is doing this. Wouldn't it make more sense for the male to mate and then run like hell and mate again? Why is the male giving up his entire life for the opportunity to mate just once? Why does the male not even struggle as the female devours him? The answer is, first of all, these are spiders living in a semi-desert habitat, and they're pretty widely spaced. They're scattered pretty far, meaning that a male does not have a very good chance of finding a second female. In fact, most males don't find a female at all. And if a male finds one, there's no reason to think he's going to be even better at finding a second. He probably won't find a second. He's only got one chance, really. It's been shown that cannibalism decreases the chance that a female will accept another male. If she is well fed, she might eat a second male, but she's less likely to accept his sperm. So if you're a male and you don't let yourself get devoured, your sperm may not be the lucky ones that go on to fertilize the female's eggs. If you do let yourself get devoured, there's a much greater chance that your sperm will be the one that creates the next generation. The better nourished the female is, the more eggs she'll be able to produce, the more high quality eggs with more nutrients she'll be able to produce, and the better she'll be able to care for them if she has, good nutrition and, if she's had a good meal. Finally, copulation goes on longer when the male is being eaten, and that actually allows him to transfer more sperm. Um, and it's been found that in the few cases where a male does survive after mating, he quits eating, never leaves the female's web, and eventually dies. So there's no real benefit in trying to seek out other females. And there is a benefit, at least in terms of the number of offspring that you have, in committing copulatory suicide and letting yourself get devoured. By the way, I don't have a slide on this. You might have heard the same story told about praying mantises, where as they mate, the female will devour the male. And apparently, the males will actually copulate more vigorously after their heads have been removed. But I went looking a while back for some empirical studies of this, and it doesn't happen nearly as often as you might think. So that's one case that seems to be more urban legend than fact. There's a lot of mantis species, and I don't know that it's been tested with all of them, but it's not that common in praying mantises, but it is the norm in certain spider species. So that's an instance in which the male does not follow Bateman's rule, and it makes sense why. The male is adapted to mate. The male is adapted to hopefully pass his genes on in an environment where copulatory suicide makes sense. You also get more cases in the natural world than you might think of female promiscuity, which is not what Bateman's rule would predict. As the old and kind of stupid joke goes, it takes a woman 9 months to have a baby, no matter how many men you put on the job. Okay, that's kind of dumb and kind of sexist, and I feel vaguely cheesy for telling it. You don't have to laugh, but the point is that, for an organism like a human, for a female to mate with lots of males doesn't increase the number of offspring that she's going to have. There's no evolutionary advantage on the face of it in mating with multiple males. It's better to find good ones rather than to mate repeatedly, because mating repeatedly does not increase the number of kids that you have. That's the logic anyway. There are cases, though, where female promiscuity is favored, and this was the target of a recent study. This is a pseudoscorpion, very, very common little arthropods in environments like leaf litter, decaying leaves. I have spotted them in decaying leaves collected in our nature reserve. They're everywhere. They're harmless to humans. They're very small. This thing is maybe a millimeter in size, certainly not much more than that. You can see they look like little scorpions with big claws, but they don't have scorpion tails. And again, at that size, they're no harm to humans. If anything, they'd be beneficial because they might prey on noxious insects. And some studies of one species, Cordylocernes scorpioides, turns out that for something having to do with genetic incompatibility, not all male-female pairings will succeed. Some pairing up of males and females turn out to be infertile. Off the bat, I don't know exactly what the incompatibility mechanism is, but sometimes you get that. In this species, females will mate with multiple males, and in that case, they have a better chance of producing offspring. If you're a female who mates with multiple males, you have a better chance of at least one of the males being genetically compatible with you. Whereas if you're a pseudoscorpion and you mate with only one male, there is a certain chance that you won't leave any offspring at all because of this genetic incompatibility mechanism. So in this species, you have females doing something that's not what Bateman's rule would predict, and yet it makes sense in the environment in which these critters find themselves. Incidentally, it's very easy at this stage, and I try not to encourage it. I used to tell more jokes like the crappy one I just did, but I try to get away from that because it's easy to take things like this and import it into looking at human behavior. There's an entire field called evolutionary psychology that tries to do just this, that looks at human psychology from an evolutionary point of view, assuming that it's the assumption that we have human behaviors that are adaptive, or at least used to be adaptive. Maybe they're not now, but they were adaptive back when we were running around on the Serengeti Plain 500,000 ish years ago. And that we can understand our own species by drawing lessons from others. I will be talking about that later, but it is a controversial field because human behavior is so goddamn weird for a lot of reasons. Probably more common has been people taking human behavior and using that to interpret what other species are doing. It's suspected that Bateman was taking a behavioral norm of the society that he was raised in and applying it to other species. Um, Many of us grew up with the idea, maybe not everybody did, maybe this is not as common as it was. It's certainly the way I was socialized, the idea that men are supposed to be competitive, that men are supposed to take sexual initiative. Hey, baby, what's your number? And females are supposed to be coy and hang back a little bit and not lead them on and be selective. That was certainly, thinking back, that's certainly, the sort of advice I would have gotten from my own mother, who came of age in the 1950s. If you grow up with something like that, it's easy to think that that's the way the world is supposed to work, and take your ideas about derived from the human society that you grow up in and plaster those on the non-human species that you happen to be studying. This may have been what Darwin was doing, because he certainly grew up in a society where women were not encouraged to be competitive, to be good at art, music, and science, or business, and get involved in that sort of thing. They were expected, much more so than today, to be the nurturers, the supporters, the caregivers, but not the competitors. Darwin may have taken this, which would have been what he learned growing up 200 years ago, and applied it to some extent to his study of the natural world. Much more recently, Bateman is suspected of having done something similar. And you have to be very careful about that sort of thing, that you're not taking the prejudices and the unspoken assumptions and your feeling of how the world is supposed to be based on how you were raised. You can't take those and import them into your view of the natural world. So scientists might say that Cordylicurdes scorpioides, the females, are promiscuous. If you say that about people, that often implies a value judgment. Human females are not supposed to be promiscuous. Human males can be horn dogs and cool. Hey, man, that's all right. Human females, oh, no, 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 no. And that's a stereotype that to some extent we probably have been socialized to feel is right. Pseudoscorpions aren't people and don't have people brains, and So judgments like that are completely inappropriate. Pseudoscorpions do things that make sense in the environment that they're in with the hand that they've been dealt. It's adaptive for them. As we study them, we have to be careful not to take our own ideas of what's appropriate and let them cloud our judgment of what's going on in nature. Okay. End of rant. Looking at competition between or within a sex, you actually do get cases of females fighting each other for access to males. There's cases where females can be rather injured in fights over choice males. There's other cases where males can be injured or even killed when they're fighting each other over access to females. Those competitions may be a fight to the death when the stakes are high enough. The problem is that if the competition is too intense, both competitors can be harmed. So what natural selection has often done is favor the evolution of non-lethal forms of intrasexual competition. Here's an extreme example. That's a couple of male northern elephant seals. I think you saw a picture of these earlier when we were talking about effective population size. This is a species that is very polygynous. Successful males have groups of females that they will defend and mate with exclusively, or at least try to mate with them exclusively. In a typical elephant seal community, fewer than a third of the males copulate at all. 50% of the copulation may be done by the top 5 males in a group of several hundred. In this species, male-male competition is absolutely vicious. These are a couple of male elephant seals rearing up and bashing into each other. I mean, they weigh something like 1,000 pounds each, so this is like getting hit with an extremely large sledgehammer. They're using the teeth to gash each other, tear at each other's skin. That skin on the neck is very tough, but they're still ripping through it. In this species, male-male competition is frequently lethal. You wouldn't think that would normally be favored because if you think about it, the loser may get killed, but it's quite possible for the winner to get killed, or at any rate to be so badly injured that he can't go on. There are times when both lose. So you might think selection would not favor fights to the death because males that fight to the death have less of a chance of reproducing than males that don't. In this species, however, that doesn't work that way because there's an enormous amount at stake. If you're a male who fights to the death, you might get killed yourself and you might lose and die. You might win and still die. But if you win and survive, you get access to a dozen or more females that you can mate with exclusively. You can father an awful lot of offspring very, very quickly. Right. My wife reminds me that they could win, survive, but still be unable to maintain their harem or unable to mate. They could be, they could be put out of commission. Right. Yeah, my wife reminds me there's a lot of ways to lose, but the prize of winning is so great that selection favors lethal competition like that. The benefit of winning means that you immediately get to make a dozen babies or more. That boost to your reproductive output ends up outweighing the risk that you have of dying. Reason not to be glad you're not a northern elephant seal. On the other hand, In species where there's not so much at stake, it's actually a better strategy to fight and run away and live to fight another day. So the antler fights in deer and in American elk, uh, they can hurt. There are cases getting of males getting killed in those, but it's not the expected outcome. It's not commonly lethal. Here's a couple of male giraffes that are neck wrestling, and they can get hurt in those. They'll also bash their heads into each other, and those little knobby horns on their heads, those hurt. So it can be painful, but it's not usually lethal. And in this species, where you don't have that kind of extreme harem guarding behavior, if you fight and run away, you may still have a chance later. The loser is not permanently excluded from the gene pool. And the winner does not win such an enormous uh, boost in fitness that it's worthwhile to carry on the fight to the death. So you have a lot of species where one sex competes, and sometimes they may get injured. There's other cases where the competition is entirely visual, where male turkeys will blow themselves up and strut, and male prairie chickens will inflate their bright red throat sacs and make booming noises. And there may be, kind of dance fights and things like that, but there's not necessarily physical combat. There's a more subtle form of male-male competition called sperm competition that you got a little bit of when we talked about antechinus marsupial mice. In some species, a female might mate with only one male. In others, females might mate with several males, and we've seen how sometimes that is adaptive. And when females mate with several males, selection favors the males that produce more sperm. This is true of, if you look at primates, gorillas. All praise to the grad student that got close enough to find this out. Gorillas have relatively small testicles relative to body size. That's because gorillas live in family groups with a dominant male and a few females who will mate only with the dominant male. He doesn't have to produce that many sperm. On the other hand, chimps have much larger testes relative to body size, because female chimpanzees, when they're not in estrus, they don't care. When they are in estrus, I have heard of female chimps having sex up to 80 times a day. Obviously, this is with multiple males. A single male would probably be killed. And in that case, making the more sperm, it's like lottery tickets. Most of those sperm can't fertilize that egg, just like most lottery tickets aren't winners. But the more sperm a male produces, the more lottery tickets he's bought, and the greater his chance of winning the prize, namely having a kid, winning the ultimate genetic lottery. So in that particular species, in chimps, males that produce more sperm are going to leave more babies than males that produce fewer sperm. And the number of sperm that you can produce is proportional to testes size. And here's some data from, on the left, that's primates. And on the right, that's a wider range of mammals. The y-axis is some kind of index of testicle size relative to body size. And you can see the same pattern in both primates and in mammals in general. In species where a female mates with multiple males, the males have bigger testes and produce more sperm than in species where the males mate with a single female. Here's a couple of males of an African mammal, the Cape ground squirrel, Xerus enorus. They may go into estrus at any time of the year, and at these times may mate with as many as 10 males in a few hours. These are a couple of males, and you can see how they have adapted to this. Males will compete with each other by disrupting each other's copulations, basically trying to knock each other off. And the males also have among the largest testes relative to body size of any mammal. And this always makes me want to sing a particular AC/DC song, but I won't. European wood mouse, Apodemus sylvaticus, that's another species where the females mate with multiple males. And here you've got something really weird. The sperm cells of this species have hooks on their heads. Up at the top left, you can see a couple of sperm cell heads with those hooks, one that's open and one that's closed. Sperm cells from the same male can recognize each other. They've got some kind of receptors. They'll hook together and form these sperm trains that can swim 30% faster than lone sperm. You can see a close-up of a sperm train over there on the right, figure D. That's a whole bunch of sperm that are locked together. Collectively, they can swim faster. And we call this altruism because the individual sperm are cooperating with each other, even though only one can fertilize the egg. And we'll talk about altruism coming up. It'll probably have to wait till after spring break, but it is a real evolutionary phenomenon. There's cases where selection favors mate guarding behavior. I don't have a good picture, but when I was a kid, I grew up in Louisiana, and there were they're actually flies, but we called them love bugs. Because a couple of times a year we'd have this mass emergence of love bugs. They would just fill the air. They'd clog your radiator. They'd force you to go to the car wash because if you ran into them and they dried on your car, that actually damaged the paint. And they were called love bugs because males would mate with females and they'd fly around like that, a little bit awkwardly, but you'd see these copulating love bug flies with both individuals stuck to each other, each one beating their four wings as fast as they could. They couldn't navigate very well, but that's an example of mate guarding behavior. If you stay very, very close to the female that you've mated with, or in the case of the love bugs, if you're stuck in the female that you've mated with, that lowers the chances that the female can accept sperm from another male. So this is a Nebraska tiger beetle that's doing the same thing. The male will stay right on top of the female until she's laid her eggs. Okay, here's the love bug, Placea nearctica, technically a fly. And there you've got a male and a female that are quite literally stuck on each other. The male may stay coupled with a female for several days at a time, and they can fly like this. In insects, things get really weird because selection in some cases favors males that can scrape out their rival's sperm. These are a couple of dragonflies. Male dragonflies have copulatory organs that look like freaking Swiss Army knives. There's all kinds of little attachments on those things. And when a male mates with a female dragonfly, the male is actually up front because in this picture at the top right, because the female's sperm receptacle is directly behind her head. When he inserts his copulatory organ, he's got specialized penis attachments that can scrape out the sperm of the female's last mate. Calusabruchus maculatus is the bean weevil. very small little bug. It's a couple of millimeters long. The actual length of this is about 0.8 millimeters. And when Calusabrochus mates with a female, he inserts that intramittent organ, and you can see it's got bundles of spines at the tip, and those cause rather severe wounds inside the female's genital tract. So he inserts that and deposits his sperm, and the female is discouraged from mating again, basically because she's rather badly damaged. I'm actually going to skip that slide because we know some new things about bed bugs that we didn't. And then things get really weird when you get chemical warfare among sperm. There's your friend and mine, Drosophila. And it turns out that Drosophila semen contains chemicals that do three things. They increase the female's egg production. They lower the odds that she will mate with another male. We say they decrease the female's, quote, libido. I'm not sure that means what we think it means, but they do decrease her willingness to accept more mates. They increase her egg production, and they'll kill the sperm cells of other males. I'm trying not to make anthropomorphic jokes, but I always want to start launching into that Britney Spears song. I'm in love, but you're toxic. And yeah, this is true. This is toxic masculinity because fruit fly semen will poison the sperm of other males, but unfortunately, they also poison the female. Females that never mate live considerably longer than females that do mate. And it's been suggested that this is actually what Bateman was seeing when he tried to generalize about sexual behavior in fruit flies. Female fruit flies were not accepting matings with multiple males. They were being choosy and they weren't mating very often. But that probably had something to do with the fact that a female that mates once gets these compounds that decrease the odds that she will seek out more matings. The males in this case are chemically manipulating the females. And they're also chemically attacking each other since they're chemically going after the sperm of rival males. In a number of marine snails, the males actually produce two different shapes of sperm. And it's been suggested, although I'm not sure if we have conclusive evidence yet, that some of the sperm are there to fertilize the egg and others are hunter-killer sperm that seek out and destroy the sperm of other males. I'm not entirely sure we absolutely know that, but it's a really cool story to think of, you know, sperm of rival males trying to kill each other within the female. It's kind of like, you know, a pack of U-boats trying to take down a convoy in World War II in the North Atlantic. Anyway, that's a mental image you probably didn't want. Yet another form of male-male competition, infanticide. This was shown beginning in the 70s with the work of Sarah Hurdy. She studied Indian langur monkeys who live in groups of one male and several females. Every so often, a strange male will take over a group. He'll kill or drive away the male. If he's successful, he will promptly try to kill all of the infants in the group. The reason is that as long as a female monkey is taking care of an infant, her reproductive cycle is suppressed. She was not only not interested in mating, she's also not going to be fertile. She's not even going to ovulate. If the stranger male can kill off all of the infants, the females will come into estrus sooner, and he'll get a head start on producing offspring of his own. So you could see infanticide as a form of male-male competition. Incidentally, the females try to stop the male. They'll actually uh, form these cooperative all-female groups that will try to keep the strange male from killing their offspring. Sometimes it works, and unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't. Male lions do this sort of thing as well. If a male takes over a pride, the male will try to kill the cubs, and that will make the females receptive sooner. Because if a female has a newborn cub, she's not going to be fertile for another 18 months. There again, you've got a difference in evolutionary interest between males and females. It is to the male's advantage to try to kill the cub because he will be able to have more offspring if he does. It's to the female's advantage to protect their cubs. So the females form these communal cub rearing groups that can collectively defend against a lone male. That being said, the males are always watching their chance. So yeah, you probably thought that the Lion King was fictional, but that part is actually based on reality, where Scar tries to kill Simba. The bit with the goose-stepping Nazi hyenas is fictional, but that much is quite true. I've made it sound like females are kind of passive battlegrounds, but in many cases, that's not the case. Female choice is actually quite active. And there's been a lot of studies of this since the 70s in altricial species of birds. Bird species that are precocial are ones where the offspring are born relatively well developed and relatively active. Chickens and ducks, for example, can walk around and find their own food within hours of hatching. Altricial species of birds, the birds are born naked and completely helpless, and both parents have to invest a considerable amount of energy flying around, finding food, bringing it back, and stuffing it into the mouths of their babies. I need to find this really great cartoon that shows a human baby in a baby carriage, and a couple of robins are sitting on the handle of the baby carriage, and one is saying to the other, "It's still hungry. I've been stuffing worms into it all day." Right. Many altricial bird species form pair bonds. A male and a female will pair up, they'll build the nest together, they'll take care of the babies together. And it used to be thought that birds were sexually monogamous as well as being socially monogamous. That lasted until the advent of direct genetic testing methods in the 80s, using electrophoresis to test paternity. And it turns out that both female and male birds actively seek out EPCs, or extra pair copulations, which is exactly what it says. Many species of birds, even though they pair up, they are not, I hate to use words like faithful because that carries value judgment with it, but they are not monogamous. They will both mate with other partners. It's adaptive for males to seek out EPCs because if you're a male bird and you mate with a female that you're not paired with, you'll leave offspring and you don't have to invest in raising them, right? If you mate with a bird that's paired with a second male, that second male is going to have the job of raising the offspring, and you don't. You get offspring for free, as it were. You leave more copies of your genes in the next generation if you copulate outside your pair than if you don't. So in the case of males, that seems to make sense, but in many species, females will actively seek out extra pair copulations. That's another case where Bateman's rule doesn't seem to work. It's been theorized that females seek out extra pair copulations as insurance against genetic incompatibility, much the same reason why those pseudoscorpions do. But there was a study with one species of bird, a European bird called the reed bunting, showed that at least in this species, this is not likely. If it was genetic incompatibility, you might expect that there would be more infertile eggs in nests where the females had not sought out extra pair copulations, and there'd be fewer infertile eggs in nests where the females had sought out extra pair copulations. But in this species, that didn't happen. There's no correlation between infertile eggs and EPCs. That hypothesis could well hold in other species of bird, but that's one case I know of where it turned out not to be right. More recently, Nicole Gerlach and company studied dark-eyed juncos, which I think we get around here. I used to see them around our feeder in the winter. Junco hyemalis. And it turns out that offspring that are produced by EPCs have higher lifetime fitness than nestmates that are produced by within pair copulations, or WPCs. So you don't just look at the number of offspring that a female has, you look at not just her kids, but her grandkids. And the idea is that a female that seeks out extra pair copulations leaves more grandchildren than a female that doesn't. Because offspring produced by EPCs, maybe they're more attractive, maybe they're healthier, maybe they're more energetic. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but the offspring of EPCs have higher lifetime fitness than nestmates that are produced by WPCs. Reed buntings, there's reed buntings again. What you're looking at here on the y-axis is a measurement of heterozygosity. And it's been shown that EP extra pair young that are produced by extra pair copulations, are more heterozygous than their within pair youngs. And the reasons may be that females are not picking genetically superior males, but genetically dissimilar males. Remember that generating variation in itself is an adaptive feature of sexual reproduction. A population with lots of variation has built in a defense against predators and diseases and things like that. We saw that a couple of lectures ago. So it may be advantageous to females just to produce more heterogeneous, more diverse, more heterozygous offspring. So that might explain extra pair copulations, at least in reed buntings. All right, I'm coming up on time, and hot dang, I have just run out of slides. What a happy coincidence there. So I'm going to stop recording now.